The first time Maya Tomlinson laid eyes on the property, it was the stillness that struck her most. A silence that didn't feel hollow or tense, but grounding full. The house itself wasn't grand or particularly modern, a two-bedroom bungalow tucked into the elbow of a gentle hill, its wood-paneled exterior stained honey gold by years of sun. It had stood longer than most homes in the area, a remnant of an older zoning era when lots were larger, spacing between neighbors more generous. That sense of breathability, of space and peace, is what drew Maya in the moment she stepped out of the car. After 3 decades working in the public sector, managing people, deadlines, and chaos in equal measure, she decided it was time to claim something for herself, not a reward. Exactly, but a redefinition. She wasn't running from anything. There had been no dramatic divorce, no illness, no scandal. Just the steady erosion of need for noise, for city lights, for conversation without meaning. What she longed for now was rhythm, stillness, ownership, something grounded. She had done her due diligence, of course. The property had come on the market quietly, and she'd found it through a small local agency, rather than the endless scroll of high-contrast photos and inflated promises online. The listing had been modest, almost apologetic about the overgrown slope in the back and the irregular property line along the southern edge, as if these natural inconsistencies might deter a buyer. But for Maya, that very irregularity gave the land its soul. The lot dipped behind the house into a wild patch of ferns and hardwoods, then sloped gently toward a narrow stream that trickled between stones and tree roots. It wasn't manicured, but it was vibrant, alive with birdsong, raccoon trails, and the soft rustle of wind through untouched grass. It didn't need landscaping. It needed someone who wouldn't ruin it. The purchase process had been straightforward. The title was clean, the survey current, the seller cooperative. Maya had even paid for a secondary boundary survey, not because she mistrusted anyone, but because she liked certainty. She kept the documents neatly organized in a blue accordion folder, each labeled tab standing at quiet attention. There was a sense of comfort in knowing that she could open that folder at any time and find proof maps, dates, legal language that this place belonged to her, and that its contours from the edge of the driveway to the final bend of the tree line were not just real but recorded. Ownership wasn't merely an idea. It was a boundary etched into the soil. The house needed work, nothing urgent, but time had settled in its corners. Maya took it as a project, a ritual. She replaced the worn-out deck planks herself, called in a contractor to re-insulate the attic, and turned the disused laundry room into a reading nook with shelves along every wall. Some mornings she simply sat on the back steps with a cup of coffee, staring into the sun-dappled slope that dropped down toward the creek. That land was hers, too. She'd walk it slowly, sometimes in house slippers, noting where wild mushrooms grew in the shade, where the deer passed through by the shape of their hoofprints in the soft dirt. It felt honest, whole. She never imagined that someone would question any part of it. It was in the early spring March, still brittle in the mornings, when she noticed the first sign that something wasn't quite right. A line of small white utility flags had appeared near the bottom of the slope, spaced evenly like stitches along a seam. Maya saw them while watering the young plum tree she'd planted at the edge of the clearing. At first she assumed the flags had blown in from somewhere else, or were left by a former utility crew that hadn't bothered to remove them. But they were new, fresh. And more importantly, they marked a very specific path, one that sliced through the land diagonally, almost surgically, right through the portion she had cleared by hand the previous fall, a place she knew was on her property. She stood there for a while, the hose forgotten in her hand, watching the flags flutter lightly in the breeze, like they were claiming something. Later that afternoon she walked down with her folder in hand, carefully tracing the boundary lines on the survey and comparing them to the placement of the flags. The discrepancy wasn't even subtle. The markers cut several feet deep into her land, clearly within her legal boundary. That evening she left a brief note in her neighbor's mailbox, polite, to the point. "Hi, this is Maya from next door. I noticed some utility markers on my side of the property line. Just checking in to see if they're connected to something you're working on? She didn't sign it with any frustration or suspicion. At that point, it was just a question. The reply came the next day, not in writing, but in the form of the neighbor himself, Garrett Bishop, standing at her front door with a casual smile and a paper cup of gas station coffee. Maya had only met him once before, shortly after moving in, and he hadn't left much of an impression. Middle-aged, tall in a way that seemed to dominate whatever room he entered, with a voice that was friendly in tone but never quite invited conversation. Now, standing on her porch, he spoke with the casual familiarity of someone who believed the matter was already settled. "Ah, yeah, those markers, I had a crew come in to prep for a little storage shed I'm putting in. Won't be big, just something for the mower and such. Shouldn't take more than a few weeks to get it up. Hope it's not too noisy." Maya blinked. "I think there's been a mistake," she said carefully. "The markers are actually inside my property line. I checked the survey." Garrett waved his free hand as if brushing away the concern. "That old survey's probably off by a bit. These lines around here were never all that accurate. But I've lived here for over 10 years, and the last guy who owned your place always said that slope wasn't really part of anything. I mean, it was wild land. Nobody used it. Seemed like an informal agreement, you know." Maya didn't respond right away. She wasn't sure what was more unsettling, his assumption that her legal boundary could be overruled by hearsay, or the casual confidence with which he delivered that assumption. "I appreciate the context," she said finally, keeping her tone even, "but it is part of my property. I confirmed it before I bought the house. It's not about use, it's about ownership." Garrett shrugged, still smiling. "If you say so. We'll sort it out." And with that, he turned and walked off the porch, not waiting for any further exchange, as if the matter were closed. That night, Maya sat at her kitchen table and opened the blue folder again, spreading out the survey map across the wood grain. She traced the property lines with her finger, slow and deliberate, reaffirming what she already knew: the slope was hers. It had always been hers from the moment she signed the deed. But even then, she sensed that this wasn't going to be a misunderstanding resolved by logic or paperwork. Garrett hadn't asked for permission. He hadn't even acknowledged her concern as valid. What she felt in her chest wasn't fear, but a slow, deliberate tension, the kind that doesn't explode but coils. Something told her this was just the beginning. The next morning, Maya awoke to the familiar sounds of birds chirping outside her bedroom window, but something in the rhythm of the morning felt off. She wasn't sure what exactly. Perhaps it was the low rumble she could just barely hear beneath the sounds of nature. A dull mechanical noise that didn't belong in her peaceful routine. She dressed quickly, tied her hair back without looking in the mirror, and stepped outside, still hoping that what she suspected wasn't true. As she rounded the side of the house and looked down the slope behind it, her stomach dropped. The white flags were gone, but in their place was the unmistakable presence of construction. 2 men in reflective vests were measuring the ground. Another was operating a compact excavator that had already cleared away the thick layer of moss and underbrush Maya had worked hard to preserve. A small section of the slope had already been flattened, exposing raw earth. Garrett stood off to the side, hands in his pockets, sunglasses reflecting the sunlight as he watched the work unfold with a kind of passive authority, like a man observing something he believed to be inevitable. Maya walked straight toward him, keeping her voice controlled, low but firm. "You're trespassing," she said without preamble. "This is my property." "I already told you that." Garrett didn't look surprised to see her. He turned toward her slowly, giving a small sigh before responding. "And I told you, Maya, there's been some confusion. I'm just doing some basic prep work until things are cleared up officially. I've already submitted for a minor boundary adjustment with the county. It's in the system." Maya blinked. "You submitted what?" Garrett nodded, as if they were discussing something casual like the weather. "Minor adjustment. Happens all the time. I've got a surveyor friend who confirmed the slope used to be part of our lot back in the day. I'm just formalizing what's already been true for years. Maya stared at him, unsure whether to laugh or scream. That slope is in my deed. I paid for it. I cleared it. You don't get to start digging just because you think it used to be yours. Garrett gave a faint chuckle, one that didn't quite reach his eyes. No one's stealing anything. You're new here. Maybe you didn't know the local understanding, but that part of the hill has always been open. The last owner of your house never touched it. We've been mowing near the edge for years. Maya took a deep breath and tried to steady herself. Your years of mowing don't transfer ownership. And if you keep digging, I'll file for a cease and desist. Immediately, Garrett tilted his head slightly. Then I guess we'll let the county sort it out. You do what you need to do, Maya. I'm not trying to cause trouble. I just don't want this dragged into something expensive when it could have been worked out neighbor to neighbor. There it was again, that artificial calm, the tone of someone who knows they're escalating a conflict while acting like they're the reasonable one. Maya turned on her heel without another word and walked back to her house, already mentally drafting her next steps. She knew she couldn't afford to treat this as a neighborhood disagreement. Garrett had moved fast, and whether or not his so-called boundary adjustment was valid, the fact that he was building on her land was already a violation. Her first call was to the county's land office, where a polite but overworked clerk confirmed that yes, an application for boundary adjustment had been submitted by Garrett Bishop just 3 days prior, citing historic use as the reason for the claim. Maya asked if that gave him any right to build in the meantime. The clerk paused before replying, technically no, not until it's reviewed and approved. But people sometimes move ahead assuming it's just a formality. We don't have enforcement authority on that. Maya's second call was to a real estate attorney, a woman named Nicole Weaver, recommended by her agent during closing. Nicole responded within hours, brisk and precise. Don't confront him again. Let me handle the communication. You'll need to document everything: photos, logs, dates. I'll prepare a formal notice and file a temporary stop work request with the county. It won't stop him today, but it builds your case. Maya took her advice seriously. That evening she walked the slope with her phone and took photos from multiple angles showing the disrupted earth, the fresh tire tracks, the bright orange paint marking the planned foundation. She documented the location of her property pins, still intact, buried under leaf debris, just where her survey said they'd be. She wrote a detailed log of everything Garrett had said to her and when. She didn't act out. She didn't yell. But inside her, something tightened. This wasn't miscommunication. This was encroachment. 3 days later, construction materials began arriving in earnest. Wooden beams, sheets of siding, large plastic drums of sealant. The slope behind Maya's home no longer looked wild. It looked like a construction site. The noise started early and ended late. Garrett seemed to avoid her, but his workers moved freely, walking across the lower edge of her property, parking on her side, one of them even tossing a half-eaten sandwich into her compost bin without asking. Nicole had filed the notice and followed up with the county, but the wheels of bureaucracy turned slowly. They may issue a formal warning. She told Maya, but it'll take pressure to enforce. We might need a surveyor's affidavit and possibly a title review. That'll cost, but we're playing a long game here. Maya didn't want a long game. She wanted it to stop. But for now, all she could do was fortify her position. She dug up her original property survey and sent it to Nicole, who immediately flagged it for annotation. She ordered a second professional assessment, an expensive but necessary step to verify the pins were correctly placed. Meanwhile, the slope continued to change. A concrete pad was poured. A frame went up. Garrett avoided eye contact when their paths crossed, but there was no apology, no hesitation, only the same smug air of inevitability. Then, on a rainy Thursday, Maya received a letter in her mailbox, not from the county, not from Garrett, but from a private title services firm she had never contacted. The letter stated that a boundary adjustment claim was now active and that both properties were under review for historical title conflict. The language was vague but carried weight, like a shadow being cast over something she thought was fully hers. Nicole called it a stalling tactic designed to give Garrett more time to complete his build while muddying the water with paperwork and pending status. Maya asked if it was legal. Nicole hesitated, then answered, "It's murky. Not illegal. But manipulative, yes. He's using the gray areas." That night, Maya stood on her back deck in the dark, the distant construction site quiet for once beneath the misty drizzle. The lights from Garrett's house glowed faintly through the trees. She could see the outline of the structure he was building rising like an insult from her land. Her hands rested on the rail, cold and still. She thought about the deer that used to wander that slope in the morning. She thought about the hours she'd spent pulling ivy and cutting back dead wood, about the feel of the dirt in her hands. It wasn't just land. It wasn't even about the view. It was about having something that was truly hers after years of giving her energy to everyone else. The violation wasn't just physical. It was personal. And now it was legal. The line had been crossed, not just on the survey, but in every possible sense. Maya had always considered herself a calm person, not passive, not indecisive, but steady. She was the type who read the fine print, who followed up without being asked, who had made a career out of navigating tangled bureaucracies without ever raising her voice. But in the days following the concrete pour behind her house, something inside her shifted. Not into rage, not into panic, but into a kind of ironclad resolve that pressed against her from within, telling her that this wasn't something she could observe quietly, waiting for others to do the right thing. Nicole's calls to the county had yielded little more than vague promises of review. The enforcement office, when contacted directly, had told Maya in clipped tones that as long as Garrett's boundary adjustment claim was pending, their hands were tied. The fact that he was actively building on land not legally his should have constituted a violation, but the phrase ongoing administrative review kept being used as a shield against action. It became clear that Garrett had done this before, not to her, perhaps, but to someone, and that he knew how to operate in the limbo between paperwork and enforcement, where timelines blurred and accountability evaporated. So Maya escalated not emotionally, but strategically. She hired a licensed surveyor with no ties to the county, someone Nicole had worked with on boundary dispute cases before. His name was Jonathan Estes, a man in his 60s with a calm demeanor and an encyclopedic knowledge of property lines, easement law, and how poorly documented boundary lines from the 1950s could be twisted by opportunists. He spent 3 days on her land, running laser levels, scanning the earth for markers, double-checking elevations. Maya watched him work from her kitchen window, grateful for the silence he brought with him. When he finally returned with his findings, he didn't bother to soften the truth. "You're in the right," he said. "No question. The slope is yours. The boundary lines are clear. His structure is encroaching by over 5 feet into your property. It's not an error, and it's not a misunderstanding. It's a violation." Nicole took the report and immediately began preparing formal notices. They issued a cease and desist letter to Garrett's attorney of record, a man named Barry Knowles who specialized in real estate maneuvering. Nicole also submitted Jonathan's report to the county clerk's office with a demand for immediate enforcement action. She included annotated photos, the new survey, and the parcel history. Still, it was clear from her voice that she expected the next stage wouldn't be a quick fix. "He's going to ignore the letter," she told Maya flatly. "We've made it official now, so the pressure's on. But until we go to court or until the county takes real initiative, he's going to push as far as he can." And he did. Within a week of receiving the cease and desist, Garrett doubled down. The skeletal structure became a frame, the frame became walls. A roof was added, wrapped in synthetic sheeting. It wasn't just a shed anymore. From the size and shape of it, Maya suspected he was building something more substantial, perhaps a studio or a guest house. She couldn't be sure, and he wasn't providing any details. The workers came earlier, left later. Trucks arrived at the edge of her driveway, turned around casually on her gravel, left deep ruts in the soft earth. She began noticing strange things. A corner of her fence mysteriously leaning inward one day, footprints through her freshly seeded wildflower patch, and one morning was muddy boot prints on the edge of her back deck, half erased by rain, but there nonetheless. None of it was overt. None of it could be proven. But it was there like a whisper at her back, constant and intentional. Maya started keeping a written log, page by page, every day. She included timestamps, weather conditions, license plate numbers. She saved every interaction, every email, every official document she received. Nicole helped her draft a motion for injunctive relief, a court order that, if approved, would legally halt all construction on the disputed area. The process would take time, and Maya was prepared for that. What she wasn't prepared for was how isolated she felt. The neighbors, once politely curious, had gone quiet. She suspected some of them supported Garrett, or at least didn't want to get involved. He was well known in the area, a homeowner for over a decade, someone who hosted community barbecues and showed up at local meetings with a smile and a beer in hand. Maya, by contrast, was the newcomer with the survey maps and the formal tone. It didn't matter that she was right. It mattered that she was disrupting what others had grown comfortable with. One evening, just after dusk, she saw Garrett standing near the slope, not working, just standing, looking up toward her windows. He didn't move when he saw her, didn't wave or nod. He simply stood there, hands in his jacket pockets, as if measuring something. Then he turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness like a shadow melting into the trees. That night, Maya locked all her doors and windows, something she hadn't done routinely before. It wasn't that she feared he'd do something overtly dangerous, it was that the rules no longer seemed to apply. Not to him. Not to the situation. And that kind of lawlessness, when wrapped in a smile and a building permit, was harder to name and therefore harder to fight. The court date for the injunction was set for 3 weeks out. Nicole warned her it could be delayed depending on the judge's schedule. In the meantime, the building continued. The roof was tiled. Exterior panels went up. It was almost finished. Maya felt a rising urgency, not just because her land was being taken, but because once the structure was complete, the argument would change. It wouldn't be about land lines. It would become a debate about demolition, about financial hardship, about what counted as reasonable compromise. Nicole's tone sharpened as well. He's trying to run out the clock. Once it's done, he'll argue that tearing it down is excessive. That's the strategy. You're not just fighting him, you're fighting time. One particularly cold morning, Maya walked to the edge of the slope with her coffee and stared at the building that now loomed over her garden. It was clean, precise, modern, even almost laughably so compared to the crude justifications Garrett had given for starting the project. It wasn't a tool shed. It wasn't temporary. It was meant to be permanent, and it was meant to stand on her land. She didn't cry. She didn't rage. But the sight of it left something bitter in her throat, like she'd swallowed soil. That same afternoon, a new letter arrived, this time from Garrett's attorney, claiming Maya had been obstructing construction by walking onto the site without permission. Nicole scoffed when she read it. He's laying the groundwork to accuse you of interference. They may try to frame you as disruptive or aggressive. Don't engage. No confrontations. Let them stretch this rope as far as they want. We'll be the ones to pull. But Maya felt something else stir in her, something that told her Garrett wasn't going to wait for court or county decisions. He was already acting like he had won. And the longer this continued, the more that illusion solidified. People believed what they saw, and what they saw was a finished structure, clean lines, tools packed neatly, a man working on his property. She was the one filing complaints, citing paperwork, disrupting the peace. She could feel the narrative turning. So she decided to make her position visible. Without announcement or bravado, she installed a temporary post at the true property boundary, clearly marked with her parcel number and a copy of the original survey laminated and weatherproofed. She staked it into the ground herself, placed it at eye level, and let it stand like a silent protest. Garrett said nothing, but 2 days later the post was gone. Maya didn't replace it. She didn't need to. Because what came next would be legal, official, and undeniable. She wasn't just protecting her land anymore. She was preparing to reclaim it inch by inch through every inch of law that still had meaning. And if Garrett thought he could make it disappear beneath siding and shingles, he was about to learn that not everything built on stolen ground gets to stand. The court date arrived under gray skies and cold wind. Maya wore a long charcoal coat and carried a folder so thick with printed documents, photographs, and notarized statements that it barely fit into her bag. Nicole met her outside the courthouse steps, calm as always, her tone brisk, focused, but not indifferent. There was no guarantee that the injunction would be granted today, but it was the first real chance to put Maya's position on formal record before a judge, and both women knew how critical that moment was. Inside the small courtroom, they sat at a table across from Garrett and his attorney, Barry Knowles, a man with a tan that looked suspicious in the middle of winter and a face that could smile while saying anything, no matter how hollow. Garrett didn't look at Maya. He sat still, legs crossed, wearing a navy blazer and the same casual smugness that had grown like ivy since the beginning of all this. The judge, a woman in her 60s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense posture, listened without interruption as Nicole laid out the situation. She was clinical but human, factual but clear. She didn't dramatize. She let the facts speak, the deed, the surveys, the letters sent and ignored, the photos of the structure rising deeper into Maya's property with each passing week. Jonathan Estes' affidavit was submitted without challenge, and Maya watched the judge flip through the report with genuine attention, pausing occasionally to underline. When Barry Knowles finally spoke, his argument was less about denial and more about context. He painted Garrett as a long-standing neighbor, a man caught in a technical error, a victim of shifting land records and outdated markers. He referred to Maya not by name but as the recent homeowner, a subtle way of framing her as a newcomer, unfamiliar with local practices. His voice carried that practiced balance between condescension and charm, suggesting that the structure was an honest mistake, built in good faith, and tearing it down would constitute undue hardship. The judge raised a hand, stopping him mid-sentence. "I'm not hearing a counter-survey. You're arguing usage, not ownership. That's not going to carry you far if we proceed to full litigation." Barry smiled, but it faltered just slightly. Garrett shifted in his seat for the first time. Maya felt a flicker of something in her chest, not relief, not yet but a disruption in the quiet dread that had lodged itself there for weeks. After brief deliberation, the judge granted the preliminary injunction, effective immediately. Garrett was ordered to cease all construction activity on the disputed zone, and the court would await further evidence before deciding whether the structure needed to be altered or removed. It wasn't final victory, but it was enough. Maya walked out of the courthouse with her spine straighter than it had been in a month, the cold no longer bothering her. Nicole looked at her and simply said, "We just made our mark." But the silence that followed was heavier than expected. Construction stopped, yes, but something in the rhythm of the neighborhood shifted. Garrett no longer passed her driveway. He stopped acknowledging her existence altogether. Trucks stopped coming, the sound of power tools ceased, and for the first time in weeks, the air was quiet again. Yet it was not peace, it was tension buried under a fragile layer of civility. The structure remained, looming at the edge of her land like a monument to entitlement. And soon Maya began to notice other changes. Packages that were supposed to be delivered to her home ended up at different addresses. A delivery driver knocked on her door and asked for Garrett, confused when she told him he had the wrong house. Her online orders listed undeliverable statuses despite being confirmed. Nicole looked into it and discovered a subtle but very real issue. The mapping system some carriers used had shifted her boundary slightly, just enough for automated GPS to assume Garrett's address now partially matched hers. It wasn't enough to file a claim, it wasn't dramatic, but it was deliberate. Somewhere Garrett had filed a temporary address expansion request for delivery coordination, and because no one in the county cross-checked parcel data with shipping systems, it went through. Maya fixed it by contacting every carrier individually, but the message was clear: he wasn't going to build anymore, but he wasn't stepping back either. He was creating fog, muddying systems, disrupting the small routines that held life together. It was another front in the quiet war, and Maya responded by tightening her own lines. She installed a property marker again, this time in steel mounted directly into a concrete footing with reinforced bolts. She hired a part-time maintenance tech to do regular walkarounds along her boundary and file condition reports. She added lighting to the slope, not harsh, just visible. A boundary illuminated was a boundary protected. 2 weeks later, she received a call from Nicole. The county had flagged the structure as non-compliant under a zoning ordinance they'd previously overlooked. Garrett had submitted paperwork under an accessory use provision, but because the structure crossed into Maya's land, it violated that exemption. The county's Office of Code Compliance would now be involved, not just the civil courts. It was a small technical win, but it brought enforcement into play. Real consequences. A letter would be sent to Garrett giving him 30 days to submit a remediation plan or face penalties. Maya didn't celebrate. She simply walked to the slope that night, stood beside the building, and listened to the wind as it moved through the trees. No shouting, no dramatic confrontation, just presence. She was still here. And she wasn't moving. The letter from the county did not sit quietly in Garrett's hands. Within days of its arrival, Maya sensed a shift, not loud or obvious, but perceptible in the way the air around her home grew heavier, more watchful. The ceasing construction had initially brought a kind of sterile calm to the slope, as though the structure itself were in limbo, waiting to be either legitimized or condemned. But now that pause gave way to something more strategic. The first sign was the sudden appearance of a landscaping crew hired not by her, but by Garrett. They worked not on the disputed area, but along the far edge of his yard, trimming hedges, rerouting drainage, laying stones along a path that curved dangerously close to the shared property line. At a glance, nothing illegal was happening. But to Maya, it was clear he was reinforcing his space visually, marking dominance through aesthetics, making his presence impossible to ignore even when silent. The crew ran their leaf blowers for hours, though the trees had long since shed. They parked close to her fence. On one occasion, one of them left a wheelbarrow half blocking her driveway for nearly an hour. Each act was minor, deniable, but layered together, they became a low-grade siege. Nicole kept pressing through legal channels. The zoning violation had opened a procedural door, but Garrett's attorney responded with equal speed, submitting a temporary compliance plan that Maya knew was smoke and mirrors. The plan included vague language about boundary negotiations, a term that suggested some mutual uncertainty that never existed. Nicole advised patience. They're trying to reposition this as a neighborly misunderstanding that got out of hand. We can't give them any material to support that narrative. Let the process do its work. Maya understood the logic, but the tension of inaction gnawed at her. It felt like watching someone casually repaint your car while you're stuck waiting for permission to protest. One afternoon, as she returned home from the grocery store, she noticed a group of 3 people standing near the base of the slope, 2 men and a woman, all in casual outdoor gear. They weren't from the county, that much was obvious. They held clipboards, took photos, and spoke in low tones while walking the perimeter of the disputed land. Maya approached, calm but firm, and asked who they were. The woman responded politely that they were from a local design consultancy reviewing the spatial viability of an alternate layout. When pressed, she added that they were conducting a site assessment on behalf of a client exploring accessory use conversion. Maya didn't need to hear more. Garrett was preparing a fallback plan to reclassify the structure, to rename its function, perhaps even to apply for retroactive zoning under a different code. It was another maneuver, another delay, another effort to turn theft into a series of bureaucratic checkboxes. She reported the incident to Nicole, who requested that all third-party consultants be barred from the disputed land until the matter was settled. A formal request was filed with the county, citing trespass concerns and procedural interference. Maya began to feel the strain of the battle not just in her mind but in her body. Her sleep became fragmented. Her appetite dulled. She found herself second-guessing every sound outside, every unfamiliar car parked near the corner. There were no threats, nothing actionable, but she knew Garrett was tightening the net not with violence, but with attrition, draining her energy through endless ambiguity. Then came the letter from his attorney claiming property damage. It alleged that Maya's lighting system, installed along the boundary, had caused light pollution and soil destabilization, affecting the integrity of Garrett's landscaping. Nicole's response was swift and clinical, dismantling the accusation in legal terms, but it signaled a new tactic. They were no longer defending, they were on the offensive, building a case not only to undermine her claim, but to paint her as a disruptive neighbor whose actions were irrational, hostile, and rooted in emotional instability. In response, Nicole filed a motion for protective status, limiting further third-party access to the area and requesting judicial confirmation of the original boundary survey. Meanwhile, Maya took a quiet but deliberate step of her own. She hired a local land stewardship consultant not to survey, not to litigate, but to document the ecological impact of the unauthorized structure. The report wasn't dramatic, but it was precise. Native species had been disrupted, soil compaction had begun to alter drainage patterns, and root damage near the cedar tree at the slope's center could result in destabilization. Maya wasn't sure if the report would hold legal weight, but it gave her something else, evidence that the damage wasn't theoretical. Her land had already changed. The theft wasn't just spatial. It was environmental, creeping like mold into the roots of what she thought she owned. As spring returned, the pressure mounted. Garrett filed for a variance, requesting exemption from full structural rollback in exchange for property tax compensation. The variance hearing was scheduled for early April, and Maya prepared for it like she had prepared for court, with evidence, clarity, and a grim understanding that the battle was now public. The hearing took place in a fluorescent lit room inside the county administration building, attended by 3 zoning board members, a clerk, and a small group of community observers. Garrett's argument, delivered by his attorney, was rehearsed and slick. They described the structure as low impact, non-commercial, and functionally essential, and they emphasized the hardship of dismantling a building that had, in their words, become part of the natural character of the area. Maya countered not with passion but with precision. She presented the timeline of events, the surveys, the court injunction, and the zoning violations. She included the ecological report, the photos of encroachment, and the correspondence trail. She spoke calmly, with the exhaustion of someone who had learned how to endure, and in the final moments of the hearing, she said, "This isn't about a shed. It's about the idea that someone can take a part of your life, plant something in it, and ask forgiveness instead of permission. If that's how we define community, then we've already lost more than a few feet of land." There was no immediate ruling. The board would deliberate. Maya walked out of the hearing not with hope but with steadiness. Whatever the decision, she had said what needed to be said, on the record, in the full light of institutional judgment. A week later, the verdict came. The variance was denied. The structure remained in violation. Garrett had 30 days to submit a compliant removal plan. He could appeal, of course, but the tide had shifted. The system had finally spoken. Still, Maya didn't celebrate. She knew enough to understand that losing a battle didn't always end a war. And Garrett, from what she'd seen, was not someone who surrendered. He was someone who regrouped, who waited, who looked for cracks. And so she braced herself. Not for a final blow, but for the next quiet move. The next shadow behind the hedge. The next line drawn, not in ink, but in concrete. The letter from the zoning board arrived in a plain envelope with no indication of what was inside. And Maya opened it at her kitchen table with the calmness of someone who had already prepared for either answer. As she read the decision denial of variance, mandatory removal of the structure within 30 days, she felt no surge of triumph, no vindication or flood of relief. Instead, what settled in her was something far quieter but heavier, a long exhale she hadn't realized she'd been holding for weeks, maybe even months. The words on the page didn't erase what had happened. They didn't restore the slope to the untouched place it had once been, but they meant the system had not looked away. They meant she wasn't invisible. And in a conflict where silence had so often been used as a weapon, being seen was no small thing. The days that followed were unnervingly still. No workers returned. No movement stirred behind Garrett's fence. The structure remained, of course, unfinished but intact, a box of shadow at the edge of her land, but there were no signs that Garrett was preparing to comply with the order. Maya documented everything, the passage of time, the lack of action, the unchanged boundary. Nicole filed a compliance check request with the Enforcement Division, and the clock officially began ticking. But the silence took on a new character, less like surrender and more like waiting. And Maya knew Garrett wasn't finished. He was just repositioning himself. It began subtly, as it always did. First, she noticed her irrigation timer had reset, nothing dramatic, but her plants were visibly underwatered one morning, and when she checked the system, the schedule had reverted to default. Then she found one of her solar lights unscrewed and left face down in the soil. Days later, the compost bin was flipped over, its contents spilled out across the garden path. None of these things were criminal, and none could be definitively traced to Garrett, but they carried his signature, the methodical pettiness, the plausible deniability. The message was simple: if I can't win, I'll rot the edges of your peace. One afternoon, Maya returned from the store to find a utility truck parked in front of Garrett's driveway. Two men in reflective vests were adjusting something near the power meter. She didn't approach them, didn't interfere, but as she stepped onto her porch, she noticed one of them glance toward her yard, then quickly look away. That evening, her outdoor lights flickered once, briefly, then stabilized. Nicole told her not to jump to conclusions. Coincidence is still allowed to exist, she said, though even her voice carried a note of doubt. Maya didn't argue. Instead, she printed out copies of her utility records and placed them in a folder marked incidents. She didn't know when or if she'd need them, but the habit of preparation had become second nature by now. And then, one night, it escalated. It was just after 2 a.m., when she woke to a hollow metallic sound, a clang that reverberated off the side of her house like someone had struck a metal pipe. She sat up, heartbeat already accelerating, and moved to the window, drawing the curtain back slowly. Nothing. The yard was empty, motionless, cast in blue-gray by the porch light. She stood still, eyes scanning the edge of the slope, the corner of the fence, the gap between trees. No movement, no shadows out of place. She considered going back to bed, then thought better of it. Instead, she went downstairs, stepped onto the porch, and simply stood there, her breath curling in the cold. 10 minutes passed. 15. She was about to return inside when she saw it. A single brick, placed at the center of her garden path, perfectly aligned, surrounded by undisturbed gravel. It hadn't been there before. There was no pile of bricks nearby, no reason for it to exist. Just one, placed with intention, as though marking a spot or daring her to remove it. Maya didn't touch it. She photographed it, logged the time, the lighting, the weather. She then walked to the shed, took out a lockbox she hadn't opened in years, and retrieved the small infrared camera she once used for trail monitoring when she still hiked frequently. She mounted it facing the path, concealed it in the branches of a shrub, and returned to bed, not to sleep but to wait for daylight. The next morning, the brick was gone. In the footage, grainy but clear, a figure entered the yard just after 3:40 a.m. Hooded, gloved, moving with practiced caution. The face wasn't visible, the build ambiguous, but the way the figure paused near the camera, head tilting as if scanning the surroundings, was all too familiar. The footage wasn't proof. It wasn't enough to bring charges. But it was enough to give her what she needed, a declaration of intent. Nicole advised caution. "This is psychological now," she said. "He's not contesting the ruling anymore. He's punishing you for winning." Maya nodded, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "Then we respond like we have from the start, with clarity, with process, and without fear." They filed a protective order, citing the footage, the pattern of behavior, the documented interference with property. The judge approved it, limited in scope but enforceable. Garrett was prohibited from entering within 10 feet of the property line, pending compliance with the original removal order. The deadline was now 10 days away. If he failed to act, the county could step in with contractors to remove the structure themselves at his expense, with additional fines. And still the building stood. On the 9th day, just before dusk, Maya returned home to find a moving van parked in Garrett's driveway. No lights were on, no voices. The house looked dormant, paused mid-breath. Over the next hour, 2 men in dark jackets loaded boxes into the van. No furniture, no tools, just boxes. At one point, she saw Garrett standing in the shadows near his porch, arms crossed, unmoving. He didn't look at her, didn't acknowledge her presence. He simply watched the van and then, as the last box was packed, walked back inside. By morning, the van was gone. Garrett's truck remained. But no activity stirred. That week, the county sent a demolition crew. 2 men, 1 truck, a clipboard, and no ceremony. They arrived early, worked efficiently, and by noon, the structure was a pile of wood and bent nails. Maya didn't watch the whole process. She stayed inside, drank coffee, and waited for the sound of hammers to fade. When she stepped outside again, the slope was raw, gouged, but free. And though the soil was torn, the boundary held. She didn't feel victorious. She felt weathered, but also, for the first time, unshaken. In the weeks that followed the demolition, the slope behind Maya's home began to resemble something like itself again, not fully restored, not untouched, but no longer violated. The raw earth left behind by the removal crews slowly darkened with spring rain, and patches of moss crept back over the wounded ground, as if trying to erase the memory of the structure that once stood there. Maya didn't rush the recovery. She left the soil bare for a time, walking the path each morning with quiet, deliberate steps, not planting, not pruning, simply existing with the space as it was. The damage had been done, yes, but the line had held. And that mattered more than anything. The system had worked, slowly and imperfectly, but it had worked. The boundaries defined in her deed were upheld. The silence that once hovered like a threat around her home had settled into something else, an emptiness, perhaps, but not one that frightened her. It was the quiet left behind after noise has given up. Garrett remained in his house, but he no longer stepped onto his back porch. His presence, once intrusive and constant, had diminished to a point of near invisibility. His truck was rarely moved. Lights in the windows flickered only occasionally at night. Maya never spoke to him again, nor did she try. There was nothing left to say. Everything that needed to be answered had been answered in courtrooms, in filings, in decisions stamped and filed under case numbers she now knew by heart. The protective order remained in place, though she suspected he no longer had any appetite for proximity. His appeal period passed without action. The county imposed fines for the delay in compliance, and those too went unanswered, eventually transferred to the property tax record. It was no longer Maya's concern. She had fulfilled her part. She had stood her ground, literally and figuratively, and prevailed not through force but through structure, persistence, and the unglamorous power of patience. She did, eventually, restore the slope not to its previous state but into something new. She hired a small conservation landscaping crew to replant native shrubs and ground cover, deliberately choosing slow-growing species that encouraged wildlife and minimized erosion. They didn't ask questions. They worked carefully, leaving her a hand-drawn plan and a list of what would bloom first and when. She kept it pinned to the inside of her pantry door, a quiet promise of things returning, not in defiance of what had happened, but because of it. She installed a bench halfway down the hill, not facing the house but the trees beyond, where the light filtered in softly during the morning hours. It became a place not of retreat but of reclamation. She would sit there in the early light, often without a book or a phone, letting the air move around her, letting herself breathe again. Her relationship with the neighborhood remained polite but distant. Some neighbors offered brief nods in passing, others avoided eye contact altogether. No one asked her what happened, but she knew they knew. She'd become a fixed point in their local lore, now the woman who took a boundary dispute all the way and won. Whether they admired her or resented her, she didn't much care. She hadn't come for community. She'd come for peace. And peace, at last, had been earned. Nicole eventually closed the file, sending her one last email with the subject line "Final Resolution." It included a copy of the court's dismissal notice, the enforcement confirmation, and a closing invoice marked "Paid in Full." Maya printed it out and placed it at the back of her blue folder, the one that had grown thick with the weight of the fight. She stored it in a cabinet not to forget, but so she wouldn't have to look at it again. It was over. Spring turned to summer. The light changed. The wildflowers she hadn't planted still found their way into the corners of her yard. Deer returned to the edge of the trees. The sound of water moving through the creek at the bottom of the slope became more pronounced. Like it, too, was no longer being muffled by interruption. One evening, as she stood on her deck with a glass of water in hand, she caught sight of Garrett's house through the tree's windows, dark, yard overgrown, the once manicured edge now blurring into the woods. The house was still listed in his name, but he hadn't been seen in over a week. Whether he had left for good, Maya didn't know. She didn't wish him ill. She didn't wish him anything at all. And so the story ended not with confrontation, not with revenge, not even with satisfaction, but with stillness. What had been stolen was reclaimed. What had been built without permission was removed. What had been blurred was made clear. Maya's home was hers again, not just in title, but in truth. The line held. The slope healed. And for the first time since she'd moved there, the land felt not just owned, but fully occupied by someone who understood its worth, who knew its boundaries, and who would never again allow those boundaries to be crossed.